America's relationship with the United Kingdom is a special one, but nowhere is that more true than when it comes to nuclear weapons. Last month, Prime Minister Keir Starmer made an important announcement about the UK's participation in the NATO nuclear mission.
I can announce that we will procure at least 12 F-35A fast jets, and we will make these UK aircraft available to bear nuclear weapons if necessary.
So his announcement came during the recent NATO summit, where allies also committed to invest 5% of GDP on defense, of which 3.5% would be on core defense requirements. The F-35 news also came just 3 weeks after the release of the UK's new Strategic Defense Review, which outlines several new initiatives and a NATO-first approach. So what does all this mean for U.S. UK defense cooperation? What does the new SDR mean for long-range strike, missile defense, and space? And how might the British acquisition of dual-capable F-35s improve deterrence? I'm Tom Karako, Director of the Missile Defense Project here at CSIS. And here to unpack these questions, I'm joined by Heather Williams, Director of the Project on Nuclear Issues, and Kari Bingen, Director of the Aerospace Security Project. We'll take questions from the audience online, so please do submit those via the homepage. Heather, let's start with you. Start at the top. Why don't you give us some details of what the F-35A news is all about and what you think about the Strategic Defense Review?
Yeah, so what it all means, both the F-35 news along with the Strategic Defense Review, is that the UK is leaning in on a deterrence leadership role in Europe in a really unprecedented way. This is a really strong signal that we are seeing from the UK across the board, and I think that the big takeaway for me from all of this is that they are indicating a long-term investment and a long-term commitment to playing that leadership role. I do want to just set some context here a little bit about the nature of the U.S.-UK relationship, particularly on nuclear. As you said, it's really special. I know we say that all of our allies are special relationships. This is a really, really special one. The level of cooperation on nuclear issues, it's unique. It is really unprecedented. It goes back to the 1950s, the Polaris Sales Agreement, but then also Trident. And then it continues through today, and also there's the very unique mutual defense agreement that we have. But within the UK itself, we've already been seeing some indicators of the UK leaning in more on nuclear. In 2021, they said that they would increase the stockpile cap of their warheads to 260, still relatively low, to be clear, compared to Russia, China, and the U.S. arsenal as well. But also they've committed to a replacement of their nuclear-armed submarines, which is their, at present, single platform that carries nuclear weapons. And so the new platform, which will come online in the 2030s and have a 30-year lifespan, that's going to be called the Dreadnought. The Brits are also great.
Awesome name.
I know, they're so great at naming their things. There was Redbeard, there was Vulcan. The Americans can learn something
Very
here,
cool.
I think, on naming. But now turning to your real question on the SDR and the F-35. On the SDR, there was one quote from it that really stuck with me and I think captures what this is all about that I want to read, which is, the United Kingdom is moving to warfighting readiness to deter threats and strengthen security in the Euro-Atlantic. And so moving to warfighting readiness reflects some lessons learned from Ukraine, not just in terms of the warfighter and capabilities, but also the need for defense industrial base. They need to have the capacity to build up, to ramp up whatever needs be. A few things that jumped out at me from the SDR. The first was that lesson learned from Ukraine on defense readiness and increasing their nuclear capabilities and their nuclear defense industrial base, the nuclear enterprise writ large. For example, they are going to be investing £15 billion into a warhead program. The second thing that jumped out at me is the importance of partnerships. The kind of bumper sticker for the SDR is NATO first. But also the U.S.-UK relationship is highlighted quite a bit in the SDR as well. And so this isn't the UK going out and saying, we're at the front, everybody get behind us, we're going to set the pace here. It's very much, we want to do this in concert with all of our NATO allies, but also in close consultation with the U.S. But nonetheless, we are going to lean in a bit more than we have before. The third thing that jumped out at me in the SDR, as I said, it is that it indicated there's room to grow. The SDR was written with the assumption that UK defense spending would be at 2.5% of GDP. And obviously at the NATO summit, that changed. And so I think that, again, is...
Although it's going to take a little while to get there.
It's going to take a little while. It's not quite clear where those dollars and pounds and pennies are going to come from or where they're going to go. But I think that to me, signaled... was one signal about room to grow. The other one, which I think got lost a little bit in some of the coverage I've seen of the SDR, is they are already talking about a Dreadnought follow-on. And so this is something in the 2050s and 2060s that will replace a submarine that they don't even have yet. But it shows we are so committed to nuclear deterrence, we're already thinking about the next step ahead. The other big indicator about room to grow and expanding the deterrence mission, it is that F-35A news, and that they will be buying at least 12. So again, at least means that they could be expanding and growing a bit more. And I think that news in particular shows not just UK, but NATO's serious commitment to the nuclear mission and to nuclear signaling vis-a-vis Russia. The one other big takeaway I want to flag is that all of this has been tied to the British economy. Pretty much every piece of news says, here's how much this is going to put into the British economy and industry. Here's how many jobs this is going to create. So, for example, the F-35As, 15% of the production of that will take place in the UK. It will create 20,000 jobs. The warhead program will be £15 billion and create 9,000 jobs. And so clearly I read that as the Labour government trying to signal, yes, we are increasing defense spending, but this is going to come back to the British people. This is going to be useful for us, and this is going to be sustainable over the long term. Yeah.
Well, I find it interesting that the numbers of the stockpile were mentioned in 2021. This was before February 2022. Maybe the Eastern Europeans weren't the only ones that saw that history was returning. But I have to say, in terms of the jobs, we do a little bit of that here in the U.S. on both parties as well. Can I stay with you for a second? Could you talk a little bit about the context of what it means for the UK to go back to an air leg? How long has it been since they had that? What's sort of the history there, and what's it going to involve? This isn't going to just happen over training, all this sort of stuff. What's going to be involved in incorporating, presumably, a nuclear-armed dual-capable aircraft?
Yeah, this is really important, actually, because by buying the F-35A, the Brits will be bringing back, so that's dual-capable aircraft, which means it can perform a conventional or a nuclear mission, which means it could hypothetically carry the B-61 bomb, which is a U.S. bomb, and that is the arrangement that is part of the current NATO nuclear sharing agreements that the U.S. has with some other NATO members, and massive contribution to NATO's nuclear mission. It is separate from the UK having an independent air leg. The UK used to have an independent air leg that went away in the 90s. The last bomb was dismantled, I think, in 98, around then. However, as I keep coming back to this, that these trends are pointing towards room to grow, to me, this is an obvious direction of travel, which would be the UK bringing back that independent air leg to its strategic deterrent at some point in time. I do also just want to foot stomp a point which might not be as obvious to the American audience to these issues, which is just how significant of a shift this is for the UK. Up until 2020, the Labour Party, Keir Starmer's party, was being led by Jeremy Corbyn, who was a lifetime card-carrying member of CND, who said publicly that if he were Prime Minister, he would never push the button, and was just very vocally anti-nuclear. But also, I lived in the UK during the debate about whether or not to renew the strategic deterrent and the decision to move to the dreadnought class. And it was a hard debate. It was a different time. It was 2013, 2014. The world looked very different. But there was a sense that, wow, the UK might get out of the nuclear game altogether. And here we are, a decade later, with a Labour government being the one to lean into the nuclear deterrence mission. What that says to me is just how much the security environment has changed. This is not being driven, this isn't happening in a vacuum. The middle has shifted. The middle has completely shifted. And that is largely being driven by Vladimir Putin.
Yeah. So, Kari, over to you. You were over at the NATO summit. I wonder if you might chat a little bit about your takeaways, both from the summit and from the SDR.
Well, and first I have to say, we are trying in the United States on the naming game. I'd say Indo-PACOM's Hellscape Initiative is a pretty good name. Yes, I was at the NATO summit at the end of June and actually participated the day before in the NATO Defense Industry Forum. Some of the takeaways and themes that stood out to me was exactly where Heather ended, is there is a clear recognition, and there was a clear statement in the communique, that Russia poses a long-term threat to the alliance, to Europe. And I think there's this reckoning happening, not just within the UK as you see it within the Strategic Defense Review, but across the continent within the alliance, that the Russia threat will not subside. It is a threat to the broader continent, not just its former satellite states, and that even once the Ukraine conflict is resolved, that Russia will still pose a threat to Europe. So there's that piece. The 5% piece that you highlighted, Tom, I mean, that was very much, I'll say, a political victory across the alliance, is getting nations to commit to 5%. Although the challenge and all the talk behind the scenes was, okay, yes, we're on this trajectory towards 3.5%. You know, we do want to see firm commitment to that. But there's that remaining 1.5%. What is going to count? Mm-hmm. Will it be investments in critical infrastructure, investments in high tech, civilian resilience, those kind of things? So there's a lot that's still up for debate. At the industry forum, Secretary General Rutte spoke, and his message to industry was, okay, you know, we're committing 5% to defense. Industry, you need to deliver. His quote was, deliver, deliver, deliver. So there was a sense of urgency imparted to the group, as well as a focus on innovation. We need to bring our best high tech to the table, look at software, not just hardware. And I think there was also a clear recognition in Europe that we just don't have the industrial base, capacity, speed, even some of the bureaucratic barriers and processes that stand in the way. I mean, there are a whole host of issues that we have to tackle to actually make any of this real. So I think the buzz and the discussions below the surface were, you know, where are the details, and you know, how are we actually going to implement it? You know, show us action.
Yeah. So I'll just say, you know, from my point about missile defense, and I know that they were kind of taking a hard look at air and missile defense and leading up to the SDR's completion, and I think there's a couple things that stood out to me. One on the details. Mm-hmm. I want to quote. This is a report from RUSI by Matthew Saville about the SDR, and said there's no description of what the force mix should be in terms of uncrewed systems. It says integrated air and missile defense receives 1 billion pounds without any detail of what it should achieve. And he says the review can tell us the curiously precise figure of 7,000 new long-range weapons alongside 6 new factories, but nothing about the factories or the weapons themselves, which is exactly what I was wondering. Is I saw 7,000 long-range weapons. I'm like, well, the Brits have Tomahawk. Are they going to get 7,000 Tomahawks? Because that would actually be kind of cool. But we're left kind of wondering, and I was kind of concerned that maybe they were going to count gravity bombs if they are delivered with some range. But a couple other things is I was noticing that the discussion of air and missile defense, the core of it is described as the Typhoon and F-35, which is to say aircraft-based, you know, counter-air, both offensive counter-air and defensive counter-air. I'll say, you know, it's not the easiest thing in the world to contend with swarms of missile attacks of any kind, even slow subsonic cruise missiles from manned aircraft. You know, and so the other question I have is, where's the GBAD? Where is the ground-based air defense discussion here? Because just when it comes to defense, it's really hard to do it from tactical aircraft.
Can I ask a quick follow-up on that?
Yeah.
Which has been, I think we've all been hearing that one of the things that NATO struggles with, that non-U.S., that the European members of NATO struggle with, it has been various missile defense capabilities, and that's something that they particularly rely on the U.S. for. As you read the SDR, did you read that as the U.S. or the U.K. rather, expressing an intent to step into that role and to try to up their game, potentially to fill some U.S. gaps there?
Yeah. Hopefully. I guess what I'll notice that when they talk about the missile threats, they seeing what's going on in Ukraine and this kind of stuff, and talks about the kinds of attack the United Kingdom and the United Kingdom homeland would face. They specifically highlight air and missile attack, targeting military infrastructure and critical infrastructure, and it commits to up to 1 billion pounds of new funding for homeland air and missile defense. So again, it's what's counted there. In terms of kind of stepping up in relation to the United States, the problem is it's not just filling a gap when the gap is a cavern, you know, a canyon. And there's just so many gaps. And here I would quote Mark Rutte, the Secretary General, who I believe on June 9 commented that NATO needed to increase its air and missile defense investments 5-fold, right, relative to the number of systems and what we have today. And what's that about? It's about the threat. The threat has spoken, and that's so much of the centrality of the threat, and the spending is just nowhere near there. But having said that, Kari, the rejoinder I would have to your quote from Ruta is, wagging the finger at industry. My complaint is the same with the U.S. officials that do the same thing, which is to say, doctor, heal thyself. Where are the European governments going to get out of the way and help industry do that? We see U.S. DoD officials complain about, industry not building enough ships. Well, if you don't appropriate and contract for the ships or the munitions or what have you. So I would say the onus needs to be on the political leaders, the ones with the power, and industry will hopefully be there to provide the feedback.
And I think for the British SDR, they are going to have that same challenge, which is implementation. One of the other things that I thought was interesting is just this whole emphasis in the SDR on leading in NATO, so NATO first. But I took NATO first as, we the Brits are signaling that we are going to step up our role within NATO. Perhaps that's a recognition that U.S. policy and posture may be shifting within the alliance. But I also took it as, where can the UK focus on its strengths and bring those strengths to the table, and where does it need to prioritize money? And with nuclear deterrence and its nuclear capability being front and center in the SDR, which was really interesting to me, is just how much that was the first thing mentioned. But is that an area of strength that others on the continent just cannot bring to the table? So we're going to focus there. Does that mean maybe less focus on industry or their government agencies delivering missile defense capabilities and maybe relying on others? I don't know, but I do think that's an interesting dimension.
Yeah, and just to continue the thread on the implementation challenges inside of things, when I saw that 15 billion pounds going to the warhead program, my first response was, that's really great because their nuclear enterprise, the Atomic Weapons Establishment, AWE, really needs that kind of surge in funding, and also just the motivation to reassure them, your job is really important. This mission is crucial to UK national security. But then my thought was also, well, how is this actually going to get implemented? Getting back into the nuclear business in a serious way, it's not flipping a switch on and off, as we know from the US side of things. And so, while this is a really important first step, I hope that there are other serious follow-on steps that come with it, but also to pull this thread on division of labor, shall we say, between the UK and other European members of NATO. On the nuclear side, I've heard a lot of debates about, if the US withdraws its nuclear commitment to NATO, can the UK or France step in and fill that? There really is no substitute for the scale and the level of commitment that the U.S. provides. And so I just want to caution against anyone interpreting this as, the UK nuclear deterrent can replace the U.S. one in NATO. And that's just really not what this is meant to be about. This is meant to be about the UK, as I keep saying, leaning in on the nuclear deterrent side of things. It is something that makes them unique. While France has a nuclear arsenal, their nuclear forces are not committed to NATO in the way that the UK's are. But also, the UK, they do have a nuclear deterrent. It's only 4 boats. And with 4 boats, ships, submarines. With the submarines, it means that you can only have one at sea at a time. And the foundation of the UK nuclear deterrent is this concept CASD, continuous at-sea deterrence. One of those 4 submarines has to be at sea at all times. And so that one submarine cannot fulfill the mission and match the capabilities of what the United States provides. And I think that as they look at Dreadnought and consider how much can this new capability contribute, will that fulfill the new requirements? Will that alone fulfill the new requirements? Some other follow-on options, we already talked about the air leg. If they decide to bring back an independent air leg, they might decide to develop or to build additional submarines. That's one idea that's been floated around. It's not cheap. Nuclear weapons are a really expensive business. But I think that this is just all showing the UK looking towards a future and a pathway where they lean in on their nuclear capabilities, and that is a significant contribution to the NATO deterrence mission writ large.
Well, I'll just say, to kind of answer your question, Kari, which is that, as I always say, that if you don't want a nuclear arms race, you better get serious about a conventional arms race. And the salience of nuclear weapons in this document, in other U.S. Statements and speeches, I think is perhaps a warning that we have not been doing enough on the conventional deterrence front, and we're going to have to kind of do both on that front. I also will just comment there that the sovereign warhead program also just sounds really cool. And if it weren't for the whole being a republic and not a monarchy thing, you know, we might adopt something like that. But Kari, let me come back to you on space.
Yeah.
This document, the SDR, talked about some new overhead persistent ISR capability. I was curious about what you might have picked up at the NATO summit or observations on the SDR on space.
Sure. And the SDR covered, within my aerospace portfolio, I'd say both space and air, and particularly drones, that I want to talk about as well. So in the area of space, I think the SDR was quite strong to say space is central to warfighting. There is growing competition in this domain and growing threats to the domain. So you see in the SDR echoes of much of where the United States Department of Defense is going as well, in terms of how do we build greater resiliency in our space capabilities, persistent ISR, how do we enhance our overhead surveillance and reconnaissance capabilities, particularly to track, I'll say, missiles and support integrated air and missile defense. And there are some efforts in the United States that here in this area, so there may be opportunities for partnership going forward. And then keeping it all within the frame of space capabilities, they are there to support the joint force. We need space to both understand and to strike. So ISR, precision navigation and timing like GPS, communications. They also highlight we need to do a better job leveraging all these commercial space capabilities that are expanding, as well as, given the threats to the domain, we need to also invest more in having better awareness of what's going on in the domain, space domain awareness, as well as perhaps even invest in our own counter space capabilities to defend our interests there. So a whole host of space activities covered in the SDR. The other thing I think that was interesting too was their emphasis on drones and autonomy. And actually at NATO summit, they talked about this, but I also had an opportunity last month to visit Latvia and participate in their inaugural drone summit. And what I thought was really interesting about that is the Latvians are partnered with the Brits on a drone coalition. So they're leading on the continent, working closely with Ukrainians to bring greater drone and frankly counter-drone capability into the battle space. And what was particularly, I thought, exciting about what they were doing, and frankly a model for us, is the Latvians, they have some great test ranges there. And what they've set up with the Brits is, bring drone kit, we'll test it on our range, we'll bring the Ukrainians in, we'll test and evaluate on the spot, see how those kits do, and then whomever has the resources, whomever has the quickest procurement authority, we're going to bring that all together and start scaling and getting those systems into the field. So the Brits are really thinking creatively, and I think it's a model even for us here, whether we're talking delivering our drone, counter-drone capabilities quicker, space, maybe missile defense capabilities, et cetera.
Well, on the autonomy thing, I was just struck that the little shout out on air and missile defense called out Nexus, a cloud-based C2 decision-making solution employing artificial intelligence. So they get that little plug, get that plug in there as well. So let me preface, I think, with a question that's come in from an IR professor. I noticed that the SDR talked about this $6 billion pounds for munitions in this parliament, which is to say in the next several years. And as I said earlier, 6 new UK-based energetics and munitions factories. And of course, we'll be looking for the details on that. But the question that's come in here is, how can the US and the UK jointly strengthen defense innovation and reduce reliance on non-allied supply chains and tech-critical sectors? Any thoughts on that front in terms of the innovation and industry generally, perhaps within the US and the UK? AUKUS, of course, hits a little bit of that.
It's a great question, and there's I think probably a lot of different fronts for us to tackle. I would say, I think that there's already a lot going on, and I guess maybe I'll broaden it back to, Heather, where you started, which is the special relationship. This has been a long-standing relationship. I saw it firsthand during my time working as a staffer in Congress and at the Pentagon, working defense intelligence, is there is so much that these two countries do together. And I'll hover on intelligence for a moment, whether it be in joint planning, operations, even acquisition of capabilities. I mean, the deep trust at the military to military and civilian to civilian level is extensive in intel and space. So in terms of innovation, the Brits really are should be one of our leading, if not the lead partner of choice in all of these areas, whether it be threat sharing, intelligence activities, innovation in tech. And just an example that comes to mind is when I was in the department and our team was leading an effort called Project Maven, which was bringing artificial intelligence to analyze full motion video. We were doing that in partnership with the Brits. So I think there's just a lot of opportunity writ large with them at both the government and industry level.
I would point to, I think those are all fantastic examples. I think the other two I would point to, Tom, you alluded to AUKUS, and everyone really focuses on AUKUS Pillar 1 and this joint submarine development and sustainment, but there's the Pillar 2 of AUKUS as well, which is about collaboration between the three partners on cyber, AI, emerging tech writ large. I think I'm still at least waiting to see what does that actually look like in practice, where is this going, what are some of the initiatives behind it, but the intent there I think is a really important one. Just to give another example of the nature of that special relationship and cooperation, though it doesn't get to the industry supply chain side, but it is about liaison officers. That there are British liaison officers that are embedded in the U.S. military commands and vice versa as well. That's really unique in terms of partnership and what you show each other. I think one other part I want to highlight here is that the U.S. Intellectual capital in the relationships with industry, though not all countries have that. Not all countries have those types of relationships and that kind of symbiotic exchange of ideas. And this is something where I really do think the UK is doing a fantastic job, was recognizing we need a deeper intellectual base, particularly on deterrence issues. Across the board, people have been saying, I feel like for decades, we need to raise the IQ. I don't really like that phrase, but it's what we have. But raising the deterrence IQ across NATO. And the UK really took that seriously. They have set up this new fund in the Ministry of Defense specifically to sponsor research and new generational development. And so I think that once that intellectual capital starts getting built, that is also going to contribute to the special relationship. Right now, if you ask me who is your British counterpart that you can go talk to or do a joint project on something like supply chains, it's not that long of a list. You really do need that type of kind of think tank and non-governmental partnership sometimes to help move these things along. And so that's another area where I see the Brits saying, this is a long-term commitment on our part. They genuinely are building a new generation right now of experts who can work on these issues and take them forward.
Actually, just adding to that, the example of personnel, right now, one of the senior U.S. Space Force leaders is a Brit, Air Marshal Paul Godfrey, leads future planning and partnerships for the Space Force. You mentioned AUKUS. An example in the space arena right now is it's called the Deep Advanced Space Radar, but it's a space domain awareness capability that the Brits, the US, and the Aussies are working on together, and that was announced back in 2021. The other thing that I'll mention too, sorry Tom, going back to your supply chain point, is there's also a good amount of activity happening at the investment level. So British-based venture capitalists, U.S. venture capitalists are both investing in each other's technology sectors, including companies that are doing more work in the supply chain, illumination, and provenance arena.
Yeah. Well, let me close out by, I think, combining two questions that have come in. The first one is the UK's purchase of 12 dual-capable aircraft primarily a symbolic gesture, or will it meaningfully bolster deterrence, and will Russia care? And the second question is, how has France responded to these UK developments? So thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't see it as symbolic. I see it as very meaningful. From the British perspective, as I said, 15% of those are going to be produced in the UK. It's going to create a lot of jobs. That's not nothing. But also taking on, joining the DCA mission and contributing to NATO in that way, it is really significant. And if I were Russia, the message that I would take from this is that there is NATO unity around the nuclear mission. That commitment, that unity, the nuclear component of NATO is not going away. That NATO has not been bullied out of its commitment to these issues and to the alliance based on Russia's behavior in the past few years. And so that might seem a symbolic piece to it, but it is also an expansion of NATO's nuclear mission. It's expanding NATO's and enhancing NATO's deterrence capabilities by having additional DCAs and directly contributing to the nuclear component, I think. But it's also, I also find it quite meaningful that it did come so close to the SDR. The timing here, I do think, was really significant. I mean, the F-35 announcement only came, I think, 3 to 4 weeks after the SDR came out. And so those two happening in close succession, that is really a historic moment about the UK commitment to nuclear and to investment in the defense enterprise writ large. In terms of the French response, I haven't seen a French response specifically on the F-35, but obviously just a few weeks after those announcements came out, the UK and France did announce new cooperation between the two of them. Again, that to me signals enduring commitment and unity across NATO to this deterrence piece. This new UK-France cooperation, it's not new actually. There's a lot of historical precedent for the two of them cooperating. And I think that the idea there is that they can both mutually reinforce and enhance each other's deterrence capabilities. With that said, the UK-US relationship is still the core of the UK nuclear deterrence and the UK deterrence mission writ large. And I think that came through loud and clear in the SDR. But to me, this is all signaling NATO is serious about nuclear weapons, and that's not going away.
You want to take that?
Can I wanted to add one more thing that we haven't talked about that was highlighted in the SDR, which was their emphasis on national resilience. And I thought that was interesting. You know, we focused a lot in the discussion on hardware, but there's this cognitive warfare happening, whether it be how Russia acts in this area or China as well. And so the mention of the vulnerability of undersea cables and how they're taking measures there. We've had colleagues at CSIS that have done some great work here looking at Russian unconventional warfare, sabotage, disinformation, use of cyber. So the fact that the SDR recognizes this, establishes a cyber center, for example. Perhaps, we'll take models from others like the Baltic nations that have put a lot of emphasis on civilian resilience. How do you counter disinformation? I think that's an important part of this overall strategy: hardware, software, and the cognitive domain.
Yeah. Well, I think that probably wraps it up. On behalf of all three of our programs, we appreciate everybody tuning in, and thanks as always to the CSIS streaming and broadcasting team. But I would like to thank someone else, and that is our recently departed Chief Communications Officer at CSIS, Andrew Schwartz, who just recently passed away. He was a force of nature. He leaves impossibly big shoes to fill, and it was Andrew who pushed us to do this series between our several programs. It was Andrew who built this studio and all these other things. So Andrew, you're missed, and we appreciate all that you did for CSIS. So stay tuned for more discussion on a regular basis between the CSIS Missile Defense Project, the Aerospace Security Project, and the Project on Nuclear Issues.